We have a new judge, so we should introduce ourselves very quickly.
Thomas Lundstedt, former We the People alumni, current social studies teacher.
Still Anna, still a current law student and We the People alumna.
So then I've got you both beat. Since last we met, my favorite cow, Goose, had her first calf, Rooster, so this is the day for me. I also taught We the People once upon a time. Would you introduce yourselves again?
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Anthony Campbell, and we represent East Hampton High School.
I'm Morgan Weinhoven, and we're all juniors.
I'm Aiden Favorite, and these are our lovely teachers, Miss Kelly Brown and Miss Taylor Davenant.
I like that lovely part. Are we being taped and videoed or just taped?
That's for like the center,
Oh.
and then this is just regular.
Super. Okay, we'll do question 1. So, do you agree or disagree with the Supreme Court's decision in Alexander versus South Carolina that political gerrymandering should not be subject to judicial review? Why? Compare the Supreme Court's decision in Alexander with the decision in Allen v. Michigan. How do these decisions reflect different judicial approaches to racial gerrymandering and the Voting Rights Act? How effective have state independent redistricting commissions been in addressing racial and political gerrymandering? What additional measures could improve fairness in redistricting? Whenever you're ready, you can begin.
In Alexander v. South Carolina NAACP, the Supreme Court held that partisan gerrymandering constitutes a political question and should not be subject to judicial review, upholding Richard v. Common Cause, which applied the political question doctrine established in Baker v. Carr to political gerrymandering. The doctrine is a form of judicial restraint which prevents federal courts from ruling on cases which involve powers directly granted to other political entities. The court's decision in Alexander is correct, as ruling on political issues could undermine the legitimacy of the court's holdings or lead it to overreach, violating the constitutional separation of powers. The decision in Alexander does not preclude a state legislature, court, or even Congress from intervening to stop such political gerrymanders. Additionally, a verdict in favor of the NAACP will lower the requirements for proving racial gerrymandering, leading to redistricting maps being denied more often.
In Alexander, a new congressional map was drawn which moved tens of thousands of black voters from District 1 to District 6 with the stated intent of solidifying District 1 as a Republican district, a move which was challenged as a racial gerrymander because they moved more voters than necessary and the vast majority of those voters were black. The Supreme Court used the precedent of Miller v. Johnson, which requires the plaintiff to show both a clear disentanglement of race and politics and a presumption of legislative good faith when proving racial intent under the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment. The dissenting justices were very concerned by challenging disentanglement threshold of Miller and the requirement to assume legislative good faith after a long history of racial discrimination and disenfranchisement.
By contrast, in Allen v. Milligan, the Supreme Court was solely focused on the effect of redistricting rather than the intent. Plaintiffs allege that Alabama's state legislature suppressed black voters by denying them a second majority-minority district in the state. They argued that this violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and therefore the 15th Amendment, which prevents racial discrimination in voting policies. To determine if another majority-minority district was necessary, the Supreme Court used the Jingles test, established in Jingles v. Thornburg. The Jingles test looks at historical and social factors for racial effect while disregarding intent, a key difference in the two approaches. Louisiana v. Calais, a case on the current docket, will provide a more challenging application of Section 2 than Allen and better demonstrate the difficulty of applying race in redistricting.
While redistricting committees hold promise as a solution to partisan gerrymandering, research shows that the efficacy of a commission often depends on its structure. Fully independent committees, like those in California and Arizona, have had greater success at making elections competitive and reducing partisan advantage. Conversely, commissions which lack independence from political influence, like New York's, can lead to gridlock, political self-dealing, and a result which is ultimately overturned by the state legislature. To further illustrate this point, Ohio's commission, composed entirely of legislators, had its map struck down 4 times as unacceptable.
Gerrymandering could also be disincentivized by implementing ranked choice voting, a form of voting which could eliminate the spoiler effect, promote a multi-party system, make gerrymandering harder, and produce more moderate candidates through the elimination of primary elections.
A recent Harvard study concluded that gerrymandering was still a problem, but for less obvious reasons. Political gerrymandering provides little partisan statistical differences in the number of congressional seats, but its biggest impact is in creating safe districts. According to researcher Kusuki Imai, if many lawmakers are in safe seats, guaranteed to win by a relatively comfortable margin, there's less initiative to want to do what the voters want. So if we want a government that responds to the people, as the federal farmer argued, continuing to reduce political gerrymandering may be worth the effort. Thank you. We are ready for your questions.
So many choices. So let's start with the last one. A decade ago or so, a representative from the western part of the state, though nameless here, said, when asked about redistricting commissions, I don't want more Republicans in my district. Why would it be good for him to have more Republicans in his district, rather than having one of the safe seats that you alluded to in your presentation?
I think as seen in Alexander v. South Carolina and NAACP, uncompetitive districts produce extreme candidates like Nancy Mace. In District 1, she had a secured R+5 Republican district, which meant that she was only competing against other Republicans, which drove her to be a more extreme candidate, and extreme candidates can kind of lead to a lack of representation in the entire state, and competitive elections and competitive districts produce more moderate candidates who tend to represent more people, which is why it would be helpful to have both Republicans and Democrats in districts together.
Those candidates would not want this because when they have safe districts, then they continue to get their seats back in power over and over and over again without any major competition.
Thank you.
So, in the two cases, in the question, I would like some clarity in terms of what is the difference, how does the court distinguish between racial gerrymandering and political?
So the idea of racial gerrymandering can be looked at through the Voting Rights Act and the 15th Amendment, as well as the 14th Amendment. Racial gerrymandering is permitted under the Voting Rights Act and the 15th Amendment, but restricted under the 14th Amendment. It's important to notice that in a case coming up, we talked about Louisiana v. Calais, and how it could be controversial in its ruling, and how it could be violating the 14th Amendment if it strictly looked at race. This would mean that in order to violate the 14th Amendment, if you're strictly looking at race, you're forming districts purely based off of race, and kind of in order to align and follow the Voting Rights Act, you need to follow the Jingles test established in Jingles v. Thornburg. And one of the things that is at risk with the case Louisiana v. Calais is the idea of not following the idea of race being like compact, geographically compact, and kind of just like stretching the districts, kind of just looking at race only specifically, which does violate the 14th Amendment protections clause.
So do you think the Jingles test is workable? Meaning, is it an effective framework for evaluating claims of racial gerrymandering?
For now, I believe that it is a valid way to do this. However, in the past presidential election, we've seen that racial minorities that would usually vote Democrat have voted Republican in this past election, which could be a sign that in the future, you will not be able to distinguish political beliefs with racial identities. However, since that has only happened once, it only has happened in one instance, it's hard to know if that's going to be a continuing pattern or if that's just a one-off thing. And then as far as, like my colleague has said, geographically compact, as we move forward as a society, it is thought that we're going to have more diverse areas, which is going to be harder to compact minorities into small districts.
So I'd love to hear, in your opinion, what have been some long-term societal impacts of political gerrymandering on voter engagement and trust in the electoral process?
I think specifically seen in Massachusetts, in this current election, there were over 30% Republicans who supported President Trump, but there was not a single district that went red. So when we look into gerrymandering and how it affects elections and the positive or negative effects, we can see how it can definitely silence voters and bring up a certain population, which in this case was Massachusetts not getting any red districts.
This could lead to many voters feeling like their vote doesn't matter in presidential elections because, as my colleague said, over 30% of Massachusetts voted Republican, and yet not a single electoral vote actually went to a Republican from Massachusetts. And so because of this, their vote didn't move towards anything. It really didn't count for very much. And so that leads to them feeling as if there's no point in them voting at all.
So big picture, if we think that equal representation is a good idea, and we come back to the issue that you just described, is statewide proportional representation another way around this entirely? That is that we just say, identify yourself by a party, run, and we're going to take the top 9 vote getters and send them to DC. In theory, wouldn't that allow for more representation for Republicans, and would that be better than trying to create more competitive individual single-member districts?
Are you referring to in a presidential or a
Congressional.
Okay. So in a congressional election, the Senate is already a popular vote in a state. And so from that popular vote in Massachusetts, for instance, we see that both of our senators are from the Eastern Mass area. They're from the Boston area because that's where the population density is highest. And so with districts in the House, we see that there's a wider spread of representation. And so if we were to make the House elections popular, then we'll see a similar trend of all those House members being from the Eastern Mass area, and then the people from Western Mass have no representation.
But I feel like the kind of reason that why both senators are in the highly populated areas is that if there was a senator in Western Mass, then they would be representing a different amount of people than the senators out in Eastern Mass. And if you have senators representing a drastic difference in the amount of people, it kind of gives some senators' votes more say, even though it actually doesn't in the terms of Congress.
Okay, I'm going to go rogue on my last question. This is an opinion one, so there's no right answer. In the most recent presidential election, something that gained popularity from one of the presidential campaigns was using hyper-targeted advertising. So separating out certain voting demographics by zip code, for instance. One example being in Michigan, where voters who were in minority or predominantly Jewish neighborhoods were shown different political advertising than those who were living in a neighborhood that was predominantly Muslim. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this is perhaps a form of de jure versus de facto gerrymandering, and whether you think there is any kind of role of Congress or the courts to combat this.
So are you talking about the effect of technology on elections specifically, or like when you're talking about the advertising?
Yeah, targeting voters in a way that's not necessarily redrawing them on the map, but having a very specific geographical impact on what their perception might be.
Could you ask the question again? I don't really.
Sorry, I'm totally giving you guys a hard time. For things like targeted advertising, it's not the same thing as gerrymandering, right? But can you imagine that it might have some kind of similar impact, whether that's on how people are turning out, what voting maps look like, and whether or not you think that might have an impact on how fair our elections are?
I believe what the thing you're kind of explaining is similar to echo chambers with social media, with people only seeing one side of views, and that just kind of not necessarily spread the misinformation, but just only closet you with only one side of views, and you're not seeing the full story.
Targeted advertisement is something that's everywhere today.
Yeah, please do.
Was something that we see everywhere today. Most sites and things online that we use are collecting data to sell, to find out what we want to see, to give us advertisements. And so giving people different advertisements based on where they are geographically and who they are as a person, maybe because of where they live, is not necessarily similar to gerrymandering, only because when you gerrymander a district, you're making it more difficult for them to actually win anything, while in that case, you're just trying to persuade them in a different way, in a way that would make it more compelling for you.
Thank you.
So I guess a little bit of feedback. So I really liked your prepared remarks. You really went through all of the case law, as well as citing the appropriate statutes. I loved that you brought in that Louisiana case, right? It's a current event before the court. You brought in ranked choice voting. I also liked a little bit, if I heard it correctly, the federal farmer reference at the end. That was good. in terms of some specific feedback, I loved, Morgan, when you were talking about the uncompetitive district, sort of the beginning of follow-up. I thought that was really good, as well as bringing in the Louisiana case. In terms of like the jingles framework, Aiden, I thought you handled that really well. And then, Anthony, I really liked when you brought in response to my colleague's question about, you know, the senators, right, and the disparity of Western Mass, right, versus Central Massachusetts. I thought that was really good to help illustrate the point. But yeah, really great job.
Yeah, I would definitely echo a lot of that. I also noted that I thought the distinction between like Eastern Mass versus Western Mass was important, and that's actually not something I had considered before, so I think you guys really, really nailed it there. I think you also had a very sensitive consideration of current issues, whether that was the Louisiana case or kind of the curveball question that I asked you guys, which I think you handled very, very well. Something else that I noticed is in one of the follow-up questions, I think one of you helped the other teammate, like just kind of jogging someone's memory. I think that's awesome. You guys are a cohesive team, and that really shows that you are. Super impressive stuff. I would say, I mean, again, I kind of set you guys up for this one, but if I ask a curveball question, I'm just curious to hear what you think. I don't mean to make you guys nervous, and you should have faith that you're going to give me a good answer.
Did work. There's a ton. First of all, I assume you were quoting the Harvard study just so that we knew where it came from, not that we should be impressed. One of the things that I liked about hearing is when it raises another question, which is why are we worried about extremism? Right? We take as an example that crafted, to use one term for it, districts that are safe produce extreme candidates. Why is that a problem? Right? We had a presidential candidate 60 years ago who said extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Don't quote me exactly, but that's the ballpark. So why do we prefer moderation? Because if we do, then really it casts this question much more broadly, which is how should we structure our elections so that they reflect a more moderate perspective, and we hope more people believe that their views are represented there. I think one of the things I was trying to get at with my question is, can we structure it in a way so that the 30% of people who currently cast ballots as Republicans, I bet if Republicans thought their votes were really going to count and make a difference, that number would climb to 40 or 42 or maybe 45%, but a lot of them stay home because they know it doesn't make any difference. So I think there's an underrepresentation in the actual numbers. How do we structure a system so that we achieve those things? And I don't know the answers to these questions, but listening to you guys talk about it, I'm confident that you guys could figure out at least some of the paths getting there. So I thank you very much for that and for the effort that you put in, the seriousness with which you've taken the question and the understanding that you shared. I really appreciate that. Wish you well. Thanks.